Welcome to the first ever Smarter Practice podcast. We're really excited to have you here with us. We've been planning this for years. We've just finally gotten to the point where we've got enough expertise and enough friends to be able to make this work. And so I'm Josh Matheney, Smart Training CEO. I've been in learning and development for over 15 years, and I've been in the dental industry for almost 14 of those years. I'm really excited to have Stef Simich with us today to walk through this first opportunity to have some of these conversations that we have in the background and bring them to a wider audience.
I'm so glad to be here, Josh. I'm Stef Simich, owner of Brave Work, which is a coaching firm that supports dental practices and dental service organizations. What we do is we help take current operational practices and support elevating them with people-first learning. So I know we've had many of years together where we've got to talk about what that looks like. And we've really just seen the industry of training and learning change over the last few years, coming through COVID and turnover and retention. I know it's been a wild ride for me, 15 years in dental, 5 years in learning. What are your thoughts as you keep seeing learning and training change?
Well, it's a totally different game now compared to 5 years ago. 5 years ago, there was still a lot of resistance to online learning or getting out of the classroom. But we now have the Zoom nation that has gone online and realized that there's a lot of advantages that can be taken from a online or at least a blended platform where you're doing some in person, some online. And so now we're able to take all these things that we've learned and apply them specifically for the dental industry. And I think that all begins with a skills gap analysis.
Absolutely. And that is what I'm excited for us to talk about today. I know this is something that you and I have been working through in the last couple of years is how do we identify what team members' current skills are, and then how do we match that against what the desired skills to do their job in the most effective way possible. And again, this isn't saying that how your team is currently doing the work is bad, but is it the most effective? And their current skill set, is that going to get your practice to the next level you want to grow to?
Yeah. And so what exactly is a skills gap analysis and how do you go about performing one?
So it's going to be a systematic approach. So you're going to look at specific skill set, however you want to define that. You are going to then assess, whether through a self-assessment, manager assessment on what that looks like for the team member. You're going to look at that data and then make a plan.
So this sounds a lot like what we do on the compliance side with job hazard analysis, where we're interviewing employees, we're gathering information about safety, concern issues, and we're trying to create a plan of how to eliminate issues or help that person work more effectively.
Exactly. I mean, yes. So that's exactly what it is on the training side of that.
Okay. Awesome. And so is this just for large groups? I mean, I could hear a lot of people in the audience potentially saying, well, I'm just a small practice with 6 employees. This doesn't really apply to me.
Absolutely. And that's what's so great about, a skill gap analysis is at the end of the day, whether you have 5 team members in the practice that you're serving or 500 practices across the US, this is really going to give you a glimpse into what you don't know. So in a single practice, you're assuming that because you told team members in huddle that this is the new process, or you're assuming because you put something on a bulletin board that they know that that's the new process, where this is really going to get you into understanding what's happening in your practice with your team. And then on the other side of that, with big groups, if you have 500 practices at that 10,000 foot level, you don't know what's happening in the practice. Yeah. And so no matter what, this is going to get you information that you wouldn't have unless you got a clipboard and went and asked each and individual person something. And no one has the bandwidth to do that. So it's a great tool no matter the size of practice.
Awesome. And so, Stef, tell me a little story about you going through and performing a skills gap analysis and maybe some things that you would do different now and how that worked for you.
Well, do you remember the first one that we did together? So before I even really knew, I knew what skill gap was. You hear the term in learning, right? But I just remember the first time you and I were working on something like this, and we did it. We just put the cart before the horse. We made all these training videos and all these quizzes, and we created this system that was very complicated, and we didn't just start with a simple process. And so what we learned from that is there's 4 parts that need to go into any type of skill gap analysis. The first one is identify the required skills. Simply, is it set by your team, by the role, by the organization? But we need to identify what those required skills are and then assess the current skills. There's a lot of ways that you can assess it, but that's part two. Part three is analyzing the gap. So often people will get all this information, and whether it's five people that replied or 5,000 people that replied, they don't always know how to dissect it.
Yeah.
And so it's important to learn how to analyze that information. And then at the end of the day, prioritize your results. So once you've learned what's happening, what do you need to impact first and how are you going to impact it?
Yeah. And it's such a easy problem to fall into where you're just so excited to train people, so excited to help people that you just create all the training first. And although there's some advantages to that, if you're a large organization, for a lot of smaller organizations or smaller teams, you just can't create that much content. And so you really need to start by identifying what is needed most. And that typically comes down to just 3 to 5 items that you're going to tackle in the next 6 months to a year.
Exactly. Everyone says that, the first step to solving a problem is defining the problem, right? And so I think that that is what you're doing here is you're taking the opportunity to define that problem and see how that's going to take you to the next level. And so as we talk through, what we've learned with best practices on a skill gap analysis, before we go into the actual process, I do want to touch on why it's so important. In the industry today, not just dental, but in dental industry, turnover is insane. There's always the grass is greener on the other side of the other side, or we just struggle with retention in the industry. And so by having a skill gap analysis, that's going to ensure that you are heightening your talent retention and you're also bringing new people on in a way that is scalable for both them and the practice. And so we just talked a moment ago about, the best way to solve a problem is define the problem.
Yep.
And so how would you, knowing that, like, how would you start like the big process of a skill gap analysis?
So you got to define what your goal is. Are you trying to solve a problem for just a specific job description, a specific location, or are you just trying to see where everything is at? And a lot of times when you're going through this process, staff start to get a little scared. They're like, oh, are they trying to find ways to push me out? Are they trying to find my replacement? Why are we going through all of this? And so communication is going to be so key early on in this process as you're defining our goal here is to ultimately help you be the best you can be. And as people really understand that message, then they're going to kind of elevate and help you to get the best information. You don't want their guard up. Otherwise, they're going to just what they think you want to hear.
Exactly. They want to check the box so they can go back and do their job. And they're not seeing it as an opportunity for them to truly grow their current skill set. And that's the thing is when you're doing this skill gap analysis, there's two types of skills. There's your hard skill and your soft skill. So to give you an example, one of the most requested trainings I get is patient experience training. That's what everyone wants us to build. And so when I'm thinking of patient experience training and I'm thinking about those skills, the hard skill is going to be, do they know how to collect the data from the patient? And then do they know how to put that data into their patient management software? Those are basic skills that we forget people need trained and need to understand how to do that. And then we're going into the soft skills. I always tell people soft skills is your practice culture. So that is, do we answer the phone with a smile? Do we have empathy in our voice when a patient tells us they cracked a tooth? And so by identifying what skills you're wanting, those hard and those soft skills, that's going to be that second part of going through a skill gap analysis. But there's a lot of methods to get that. I know we've worked through some. What are the main methods that you look at when we're looking at a skill gap analysis?
Awesome. And I really like to start with the self-assessment. Just let people tell you what they know and don't know. And although you could do multi-choice questions or something complicated like that, I find that gives you so much data, it can be harder to really act on when you're first starting with this process. So I like simple yes, no, true, false type questions. And so you can start by pulling up their job description and just putting in, here's what we're quizzing them on. And then the next step is, because people often look at themselves either over favorably or like maybe they're worse than they are, get the manager to provide feedback. Give them the opportunity to say, Susan's really good at this and she could use some help with this. And then when you combine the two, that's usually where you're going to start. But then you can also pull in, if you have KPIs, you can pull in some KPIs and so those measurable data points And the really nice thing about having those is that then you can see where they were at before you start this process, go through and develop some things that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then you can see, okay, we're going to see these KPIs and we got a 10% boost or we had a 30% boost in these areas. And so having that beforehand just makes it so much easier to be able to validate that your methods are actually working. And then the last thing is just those actual skills tests, watching people go through and perform a job, and then just coming back and having some feedback with that.
Yeah, those are great methods that really allow you to see how a learner is getting this information and ultimately how the team member skill is going from training to action. And that's where analyzing becomes so important. I said earlier that sometimes there's so much data that people get lost in that data. But once you get that, once you've done 1 or 4 of those methods, take a look at how they are all rating. How did they answer those yes or no questions? How did they answer the scale? And then compare that to what the goal is. Now, if you have 1% of people that miss the mark, that might be an individual issue. But once you're hitting 5% more, 10% of the team that is missing understanding or comprehending what that skill is, that's when you really see that there's a system-wide opportunity for you. But before you get too lost in the weeds, you might find that there's 10 or 15 skills that need to be trained on. And that's even for those 5 team member practices. I've seen it all. If you see you have those 10 or 15 skills that need to be built, choose 3 to 5.
Yep.
And then when you have those 3 to 5, that's where you need to develop your plan. What would you recommend to somebody who wanted to work on 3 to 5 skills with their team over the next year?
So there's the plan should include several different methods. Like we talked about earlier, there's more and more opportunity to train online, and there's some real advantages with that, where you're able to have the exact same message delivered time and time again. But then there's also some limitations where you don't get that user or learner feedback as you go through it. And so developing a training, which can be as simple as you putting yourself in front of your camera and recording a 5-minute video and uploading it onto a learning management system like at Smart Training, or then going through and establishing some mentors and some coaches. Now, I will say, just a little caveat there, is that these mentors and coaches are often the most overly worked people in your staff. So you want to be careful about putting another thing on their back unless you have an entire program facilitating their success. Because what you don't want is to have your best workers burn out and then leave because you're trying to help improve everybody else. That's going to be counterproductive to what you're trying to accomplish. So then you can just do some job shadowing as you're going through this process. You implement a little change, do some mentoring, and then you're just going to watch them and see if you're seeing those measurable tick ups. And then there's the new hire talent. And it's obviously easiest to train them right the first time, and then they're just going to do that every time. But with that, I want to caution people not to think, oh, well, I'm just going to train my new hires. Because unless you're going to have an entire staff turnover, then everybody's never going to be on the same page. And we know that our staff are our most valuable assets.
And so that's where we need to invest in, right? Is that asset. So I agree, sometimes there is time that new talent is needed just because there is turnover, there is compliance, but also as growth happens, new talent happens. And where, yes, it's great to have a training plan and onboarding for them, you don't want to forget about upskilling your current team members. So there's 2 terms that are happening a lot here in the industry right now, which is upskilling and reskilling. So upskilling is going to be what we're talking about, where it's elevating their current patient experience and how they give that to that next level, having that empathy. Now, reskilling is going to be something that we've known in the dental industry forever as cross training, right? So ensuring that that dental assistant in the back office knows how to help in the front office, and they observe answering the phone, and they use these empathy techniques, so then it's happening across the practice. So when we look at investing in our most valuable asset, it's not just elevating their current skills, but how are we training them on other needs of the practice so that they can be a even better asset.
Exactly. It goes back to that question I asked earlier. How can I better help you be the very best you that you can be?
Exactly. And so, I know we talked in depth about, how to do this. And even just sitting here, it feels daunting. That's so many steps. So, but we know this can be pretty simple.
Yep.
So if you were to, if I was to come to you and say, hey, I've got this practice, I'm busy, how do I start doing a skill gap analysis?
You start with that job description. It's the most tangible thing. You probably already have one for every position, and you're just going to use your AI learning model, and you're just going to put in a prompt that we're going to provide you, and that's going to pull out 10, 20, 30 questions for that job description, and then you're just going to work through and implement the rest of the program.
So it sounds like, so I'll take my job description, I'll put in this prompt, and it'll give me the tool, the skills I'm looking for my team members. And then if I don't have smart training, or if I don't have that, like, do you recommend just pen and paper, yes and no, digital check boxes?
However sophisticated or simplistic as you can get it, the most important thing is to take that first step. It may not be perfect, but that's fine. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good enough. You just want to get something started. And so pull up Word and drop it in and have everybody put their name at the top and fill in the skill gap. That's fine. Or if you have a little bit more sophisticated solution, then great. That's going to be a little bit easier to retrieve as you go forward. But anything works. You just need to get started.
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part, is the getting started. When I work with practices and groups, so often it's they want everything to be perfect. They want to, and that's even what we did the first time, right? We wanted to have all the quality training that they could need based on the analysis, but we didn't do the analysis first.
Yeah.
And so, what when you're thinking through that, and people say they don't have time, like, what do you combat with that with?
It takes far less than you think it does. And so 5 minutes with your job description and an AI tool can probably develop that first one, and then just go forward and start it. And then you're going to come out with probably 4 or 5 different items. And as we talked about, if you have more than that, just limit to 2 or 3, or even just start with 1. You just have to pick what's going to have the biggest impact. And sometimes it's easier to pick something that is very simple, like I always greet your patient with a smile.
Yes.
That's something that you can put your doctor in front of a camera for 5 minutes and he could say why this is so important to our culture. And that is a actionable step forward. And now we're going to just watch those KPIs or those measurement tools that we had in place and see if after 2 or 3 months, if we're implementing on what we had established.
Awesome. I know this is something that has totally transformed how you and I approach learning and training, and it's allowing different clients to see that impact with training that they're wanting to do. It's always so hard to measure an ROI on training.
Yeah.
Well, we figured it out. Here's how we measure the ROI. So I'm super excited. As we've said, we're going to have the tools, the AI prompt, all of that available. So we hope that you give this a start. If you get stuck, let us know. But Josh, I hope more people start doing this and really can be there for their teams.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure to have you guys join us today. And please continue to reach out with questions you might have, maybe some suggestions for additional topics. And as always, remember to work smarter, not harder. Thanks. Bye.